And then inside those cells, it can become activated by so-called deiodonases, and those are enzymes that can actually take away one of those four iodines from the T4 and then convert it into T3, for example. But they could also inactivate the thyroid hormone under certain circumstances. Well, then the T3, which is formed inside the cell, is then translocated to the cell nucleus. And it can bind to the thyroid hormone receptor. And the thyroid hormone receptor is actually a member of the so-called nuclear hormone receptors, which is a huge family of, basically they are transcription factors. So they actually works by modulating transcription or gene expression. So that's basically why it can have such a wide variety of effects, because it binds, when it binds to the thyroid hormone receptor, it can actually induce transcriptional changes.
I see. So, and I would imagine that in the case of the thyroid hormone, the active version T3 and the receptor, the nuclear receptor, this transcription factor is probably modulating the activity of genes that are tied to metabolism.
Exactly. So, for example, we know that when it is cold, we need much more. We need to do much more to produce heat. So that's called thermogenesis. And one of the important genes is the uncoupling protein 1. So that's actually under the direct control of thyroid hormone. So it is actually directly regulating a lot of genes that are implicated in various aspects of metabolism.
Yeah. Okay, so it sounds like there's some general principles that are worth mentioning here for people. So if I'm hearing you right, so thyroid is sort of regulated, the active amount of thyroid is regulated on multiple levels in a way that's akin to how other hormones are regulated. So you make some amount of thyroid in the form of T4 initially, and the amount you have is the amount you have. It might be high, might be low, it might be somewhere in the middle, but then there's an additional layer of regulation on top of that, which is it needs to be activated in order to actually get into cells to affect transcription, and in this case, modulate genes that are going to be involved in metabolism. And so I guess there's an analogy with how other hormones work to some extent. So for example, testosterone, there's a free and a bound version, and there's regulation in terms of how much you produce, but also how much of it is free versus bound. It's similar in this case?
Yes, it's similar for other hormones. So that's indeed, so that allows the body actually to have this reservoir of hormone from which to take at need, but then also it allows for very specific regulation of the actual availability of the hormone within cells at given times, given places. So it's all about having the right amount of the right hormone at the right place at the right time.
It's that is like a good way to think about it, I guess. It's you can have a huge surplus. You can always make sure you have enough potential hormone there, and then you can just sort of tweak how much of it is activated to get exactly what you need for the circumstances you're in, if everything's working right. But I suppose the flip side of that is we've got now multiple layers or multiple levels at which things could start to break down. So someone might not produce enough T4, they might not activate into enough T3, and so on and so forth. And so when we think about hypothyroid, what exactly is that, and what starts to cause that?
Yeah, so hyperthyroid. So if you look at the disease in humans, it's actually an autoimmune disease. And there are various forms of hyperthyroidism, but the most common form is an autoimmune disease where actually, so normally, if we look at the normal regulation, we already discussed it a bit, we have this region in the brain where lots of signals from the environment are being integrated, and it's called the hypothalamus, right? And then in the hypothalamus, TRH is being made, which then stimulates the pituitary gland, which is also located in the brain, to secrete TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, and that stimulates the thyroid gland to work harder and to produce more thyroid hormones. So normally, the production of thyroid hormone from the thyroid gland is under the control of TSH, which is being produced, depending on the needs, because there's a very sophisticated system. Because if we have too much thyroid hormones, those thyroid hormones can actually directly downregulate TRH and TSH, so there's negative feedback. And then, there is actually no longer this feed-forward drive, right?
Yeah.
But if there's not enough, then the brake, let's say the inhibition on TRH and TSH is removed. And then again, there's the feed-forward drive, which would then stimulate the thyroid gland to produce thyroid hormones. So that would be, the normal physiological regulation. But under certain circumstances, our body can make, what is called autoantibodies. For example, antibodies that start stimulating the thyroid gland and that can bind to the TSH receptors, even if TSH is not present,
Hmm.
and then actually stimulate the thyroid gland to produce thyroid hormones independent of TSH.
Oh, wow.
So it starts making much more thyroid hormones than is actually needed under that given situation, and that can, this can lead to toxicity due to excess of thyroid hormone, which is called thyrotoxicosis.
Hmm. And so so hypothyroid, hyperthyroid. Actually, before we get there, so what you just said is basically thyroid levels, sort of the logic of the whole neuroendocrine circuit here follows something that's very common in biology, which is there's negative feedback loops built in here. When thyroid levels get too high, it's kind of like a thermostat. The temperature goes up and then tells the mechanism to turn things down, and vice versa. But of course, the mechanism can break down, and then you can get too much or too little. Well, let's start actually more like on the epidemiological side. What's more common today in modern people, hypothyroid or hyperthyroid? Are there any interesting patterns there?
Yeah, so hypothyroidism is more common than hyperthyroidism. Yeah. And with hypothyroidism, it's a bit, the most prevalent form again is an autoimmune disease.
Mm-hmm.
And in this case, we already discussed a bit previously how thyroid hormone is being produced. And there's several steps in which iodine is converted to iodide, and then the iodine molecules are, built in those tyrosine molecules, and those are all performed by an enzyme which is called thyroid peroxidase. And in this case, the body makes autoantibodies against that enzyme, so against TPO. It's abbreviated, and that again, can lead to an attack basically, so that affects the thyroid hormone producing capacity of the thyroid gland. And so if you look at the data, hypothyroidism is more prevalent than hypothyroidism.
Mm-hmm.
And it can actually reach quite high numbers, especially in older people.
I see. So as it's common in older people, more common, and so is the idea here that just as you go throughout life, every day that goes by, you've got some chance that the autoimmune thing could kick in, the immune system starts to recognize something it shouldn't, and then you get hypothyroid.
Yeah, so to some extent, when we get older, there's more debris exposed, which may elicit unwanted immune reactions. Our immune system ages. There's something which is called immunosenescence. The
Yeah.
discrimination between self and non-self is kind of, not as clear anymore as when we were younger. So there are certain things that go down the hill, so to say, when we grow older. And of course, I think the peak incidence. So the first diagnosis of hypothyroidism is probably around people in their 50s. But people can, you can substitute it with synthetic thyroid hormone. So the older people get and the older the population gets, the higher the prevalence is of a lot of these diseases.
Mm-hmm.
And some people can get it also, of course, in later ages. And